Welcome to Martial Wisdom. Here you can listen to conversations on all kinds of topics related to martial arts. The topic for today's podcast is the martial mindset. Joining me in this discussion is Cale. Before we get started, please consider supporting this podcast by liking and sharing it. If you're interested in even more content, please consider subscribing to the Spirit Aikido online program. I'm proud to announce that the program now has over 250 videos. Another option is to contribute any amount you like through the PayPal tip jar. Even small contributions are greatly appreciated. I hope you enjoy this episode. Now, on with the discussion. Welcome to Modern Aikidoist Podcast and Martial Wisdom, and it is my great pleasure to have Cale with me today. We had spent some time getting our schedules linked up so we can have him on the show and talk about the martial mindset. So welcome, Paul. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Excellent. Feel a little bit of challenge with I always have it with talking with folks in Australia because our times are so different. So I think it's evening for me and it's afternoon, or is it morning for you there?
No, it's 2 p.m. on Tuesday 2 p.m.
Okay, sounds great. Well, let's get right into it. The martial mindset. I think this is a tremendous topic, and I wanted to maybe have you go into a little bit of your background too, because I don't think everybody necessarily understands just how much experience you have with so many different aspects of martial. So maybe you could go into that.
Yeah, sure. As far as my martial art background, I kicked off with martial arts in sort of towards the end of 1979. And the first martial art I did was Taekwondo. Back then, you're quite limited in your choices. Mm-hmm. So, inspired by Bruce Lee, and off you go and go look for martial art. And basically, I've been doing martial arts ever since. So since then, I've studied, always cross-trained, and not because I was sort of clever and ahead of my time, but I wanted to train all the time. I was obsessed. So we had the club formats. So most places had 2 classes a week. So I just looked for the opposite, a club that would have the opposite timetable. And I wasn't smart enough to learn the nuances of a grappling or striking art that were similar. So I would do grappling and I would do striking. So they're completely separate. So luckily enough, I've been cross-training since the 80s, but all by accident, basically. So, so I've been doing, I've trained in a lot of martial arts. The ones that I hold a minimum of black belt in, Shodan, a minimum, is Yoshinkan Aikido, if we're talking about Aikido. So I'll cover off on them. Yoshinkan Aikido, Tomiki Aikido, and Gokushinru, which is basically Yosei-kan Aikido, but with the situation with the name being held by Mochizuki Sensei's son in France and so on. It's called Gokushinru in Japan. So they're the 3 styles, and that's obviously 2 of them are sort of around about 1920 vintage, and the other one's 1930, so all pre-war styles, pre-World War II styles. I also have a black belt in Kodokan Judo Taekwondo, which was the first martial art I did. I have a 7th degree black belt with the Kyokushin Budokai under John Blooming, the late John Blooming sensei. Kudo Daijuku with Azuma Takashi sensei, and Aussie branch chief for Australia, as I am with the Kyokushin Budokai Kan. What else do I have? Did the Aikidos, Judo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I have a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm about to go into my 2nd degree, and that's with Jean-Jacques Machado. Jean-Jacques Machado. I think that's most of them. So I think it works out to about 9 black belts, and varying grades from 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 7th degree being my highest.
And then you have also a robust experience with the military and with training combatives, yes, and special forces and whatnot, which is was very intrigued to talk with you about this specific subject because of the crossover, not just from the martial art training aspect, but also the reality based kind of fighting for your life realm of.
Yeah, I'm the creator of the Australian Army Combatives program, so that's probably what I'm most well known for. And that's I'm a member of Special Forces, or former member of 2nd Commando Regiment, Australian Commandos. And I did 5 tours of Afghanistan. We're a direct action organisation, the 2nd Commando Regiment. So a lot of combat experience. I became well known in the media in Australia through a Vice documentary around being involved in hand-to-hand combat with the Taliban. So yeah, I've got that side. New Zealand now uses the program as well, so it's sort of like an ANZAC, Australian New Zealand program. And we do a lot of work with US Marines that come through the program whilst they're stationed in Australia. And I did a lot of traveling in the US. I think around about 2010, I was asked to, I did some stuff with Navy SEALs and US Special Forces, and then the US Special Forces sent instructors over to do our instructor course. The program's different to your normal, it's not an individual martial arts program. It's very much about how to fight in pairs and how to fight in teams and so on, and take advantage of weapons and accessing weapons and so on. So it's actually very similar to some of the old Koru of Japanese martial arts. I'm also currently just kicked off with Shinto Muzaru, and also I studied Yagu Shinkage for about 7 years. So I do have experience in the old Koru as well.
Sure. Yeah, do you ever sleep? I guess is the question with all of that experience.
Right now, all the time. Catching up on my sleep now.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm not good at ball sports. I don't do anything else, like it's all I've done, and it's sort of become my livelihood and my life. But I do get some unique perspectives. I do a lot of work with police here as well, and corrections and different things like that. But yeah, it's quite interesting.
Excellent. I love that combination of backgrounds, and it's I guess what I'd consider almost the cross training of looking at how martial arts, based on those different applications, whether it's a military or whether it's police, which is focused on control and restraint, or civilian self-protection or self-defense, is going to have a little slightly different flavor. But the idea that the martial mindset, to me, is that consistent thread with each one of those, because whether you're a sport fighter, you're defending yourself, you're a soldier, police officer, you're always at risk. There is a significant amount of risk there. And I think that I guess maybe the place to start would be to cover that. What is the definition of martial? Because I've seen many people argue about what martial is. And I think it's in the last 50 years, the umbrella of martial has expanded to cover all kinds of different things that really aren't really very martial. And I guess that might be a good place to start with that. The definition is martial, you get out of the dictionary, is skills related to combat and war. Basically some kind of fighting.
Yeah, well, martial, it's pertaining to Mars, the Roman god of war. So for something to be martial, it's to be to be warlike. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because whenever I speak about something, I tend to speak from experience. So I see a perspective that everyone brings to it. Jiu-jitsu guys say one thing, and Aikido guys, and then military people. And quite frankly, it's a big problem we had in the Army at the beginning, before the Combatives, before our program began, was we had, an attitude of just shoot them. Why are you doing this hands-on stuff? And then we also had the, very strong influence of the, garrote Z Germans and the Sykes-Fairbairn type thing for the unarmed combat. So the unarmed combat was so niche, it didn't make sense to people that weren't interested in it. And the shooting, it's a little bit too simple to say just shoot people. And Australia's experience up to probably up to Somalia is predominantly jungle warfare. So when you look at it, we're involved with the Boer War and so on. Any war that England was in, we're there. But World War One was sort of the second Boer War was when our nation became Australia. Became a federal country, if you like, in 1901, and so we were sort of independent states under the Commonwealth that belonged to England, and then we formed together as a country. So we had soldiers that were of states like the Victorian militia or Victorian or New South Wales Rifles or whatever. And whilst they're in South Africa, they became the Australian army, So it's interesting. So World War One was really the first time we as a country had a army. And it was called the Australian Imperial Forces, the AIF. And World War II, the interesting thing with that is, World War One, we predominantly fought in Europe and then ended up fighting, Gallipoli with the Turks and so on. But World War II saw the Japanese threat. So our government pulled our soldiers out of the Middle East, so desert warfare, and returned the second AIF, returned to Australia, and then that was the beginning of jungle warfare, fighting in Papua New Guinea and up north and so on. And the interesting thing is we came out of that with the Malaysian emergency or Malay emergency with the communist threat, and then that led into Borneo as well, and then that led into Vietnam, supporting the US. So Australia's predominantly been involved heavily in jungle warfare and very good at it, very experienced since World War II. Also in Korea. But so then came along, so the attitudes, I guess our experience is very much jungle orientated. Then we ended up in the urban space. And what you find out in the urban space is people don't just like getting shot, funnily enough. So if they're close to you and you have a fail, your weapon fails, or you're at close quarters, people will grab you and fight to control your weapon and so on. So now you're in the situation of same as the battlefields of Japan. You've got swords and stuff. Someone's at close quarters, they're going to try and stop you from cutting them. And if they don't have a weapon system to do that, they'll grab a hold of you. And that's, when you look at the Japanese arts, a lot of these arts are about just supporting the weapon system. And that's sort of how we've taken on what we're doing, supporting the weapon system, rather than me being unarmed fighting. It makes no sense to just obviously be unarmed. I need to arm myself. Yeah.
When I think of martial, throughout most of history, in fact, I think this is only a fairly recent development that hand-to-hand combat was not as much a prevalent part in warfare. Up until even a century ago, like in World War I, hand-to-hand combat played a significant role in warfare. And so to say that something is martial, to my mind, at least, when you look at the broad spectrum of human history, it involves, some kind of either hand-to-hand or weapon in hand, but you are fighting another human being who's right there, as opposed to, for example, a drone pilot or something of that nature. And even though the tools of warfare have advanced, I would say that a fighter pilot climbing into a cockpit has every bit the martial mindset of foot soldier in a trench or in the building to building type fighting scenario you described, an urban environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the mindset that we want in all our pilots. And what they have is a weapon system is simply an extension of themselves. So they're the person that kills the enemy, and your rifle is an extension of that mindset. It's a weapon system that enables you to do what you need to do better, more efficiently. So it's interesting. I guess when some people listen to that, they think, that the best thing is that it's like a sword. Violence is like a sword. You want to do good, but it's a tool, and you sometimes need to draw your sword to protect people and to protect what's important and to protect good. So to me, it's a tool. Violence is nothing but a tool. It doesn't have a emotion. It doesn't have an agenda. It is a tool that bad people tend to use to achieve their outcomes, and good people need to be skilled and understand that to counter it.
I liked, and I think Bruce Lee was big on this, and he wanted to convey this in his films about the fact that strength, and I think he was referring to prowess or skill at arms, is the virtue by which all other virtues can survive. Because without that strength, it doesn't matter how kind or generous or polite or how good your character is, but if you don't have the strength to defend yourself or your family or your loved ones, all of that can be taken away very quickly by somebody who does not have those virtues but has the one virtue of strength.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think Jordan Peterson says it well with if you're not capable of violence, you're not a pacifist. You just you actually don't have any thoughts. Yeah, you're
harmless. That's the word he uses, harmless.
Yeah, you're harmless. But if you can commit violence and choose not to, then you're a good person. So
and I think
that's interesting.
Yeah, that's because especially if you are incapable, then really your strategy is hope, and hope is not much of a strategy, or luck, counting on just being lucky enough not to encounter a bad person or somebody who is strong but has no qualms about enacting violence upon you. And I think though that, and I like how you sort of describe that too, of that within the military setting of the realms are going to be a little different. I think in a military setting it is crystal clear who your enemy is, and that you have license to use your skills to overcome obviously an enemy force. And I think the civilian realm poses some challenges because it's not necessarily that clear. And that's where that martial mindset, I think, has to switch on. And I think soldiers that go into theater, they know where they are. They know that they're in danger. They know that's where they have that stress of going into life-threatening situations. And as I understand it, this is a lot of times why they will give soldiers reprieve by bringing them out of those theaters so that they can rest and allow themselves to recoup. But with a civilian, you're going on about your business, you're out with your family, and suddenly you could be cross paths with a bad person or a potentially violent situation where you have to switch mindsets very quickly. What would you say about the idea of that mindset having to turn on and off versus being on for an extended period?
Well, I'm incapable of turning the mindset off. So I always am looking for threats and stuff, and that's probably a product of. I mean, I was in Afghanistan 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, and Iraq 2009 as well. So that's what the length of World War II. So it's going to affect you. So as far as martial mindset goes, I'm always watching behavior, and when you're in a civilian space in the battlefield, you kind of, your enemy can hide amongst the civilian population. So you're looking for behavior and you're looking for indicators. And I do that walking around the streets and so forth. I'm always looking for behavioral indicators of potential threats and assessing my environment and maneuvering myself. So I'm always making sure that I'm not going to be ambushed or caught off guard as much as I can. And if I am caught off guard, then I'm going to use extreme violence to regain the initiative.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll try to avoid violence, and I'll try to avoid myself being observed as a threat. So so that I can maneuver and so on. So that, I think a lot of that to me fits in with Aikido strategy and thinking, because obviously Aikido is heavily influenced by swordsmanship. Swordsmanship is heavily influenced by Koru and Heiho. So, if you sort of go backwards and sort of deconstruct or reverse engineer Aikido, there's a lot of answers to be found.
Oh, I agree. In fact, as going along that path of trying to make Aikido fit the way of strategy, and in my opinion, the one of the crucial principles of the way of strategy is intercept your problem before it gets to be a huge problem. It's easier to solve it early on before it gets on top of you. And like you talked about with awareness and trying to spot a predator or a threat before it's up in your face, it's easier to avoid it than to have to face it. And I was always taught that Shoto Seizu principle of control the first move, and it speaks to exactly what you just described, which is, you catch eye, you see a threat before the threat sees you. That's like the optimal strategy.
Yeah.
And that's the awareness part. And I think that any civilian needs to practice at least some of that to try to mitigate being ambushed, because an ambush is terrifying. Somebody gets the drop on you and they get the first move, and you don't even see it coming is horrible. Like, that'd be the worst problem to try to solve.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And with what you said before, you're talking about, there's a lot of argument and so on where it sits. And like I was saying before about the gunfighter, just shoot him and the very sort of niche unarmed combat. The way I overcome that problem was I basically agreed with the gunfighters. Of course, we just want to shoot people, but they don't like being shot. So we need to enable people to retain their weapon and clear people from the weapon system so you can carry on with the battle. And also to the unarmed combat people, that they need to compromise as well, so that this is not a niche skill set. It's a skill set across the board that others can study and make it niche, but basically everyone's got the foundations. So that kind of triggered it off it made sense for people. And obviously being involved in the war for such a long time, it was our longest war, same as the United States. So that sort of, we learned a lot of lessons from that. But to me, the answers have always been there. It's like we train with live ammunition, we train with blank fire ammunition, we train with paint, man marking ammunition. To me, this is just like training with a live blade, a bokken, or a shinai. It's a bamboo sword, wooden sword, live sword. And it's the martial sport, the martial art, the martial combatives, or the martial application. They're all just training mechanisms for the end state. Because the main thing is that, unless you're someone who's living in a prison system, or someone who's an incredibly brutal individual that commits violence on innocent people all the time to develop your skill sets, which those people are out there. If you're not that person, and you don't want to be that person, but we need to protect ourselves from those people, then you have to find a way that will give you the skill sets without compromising your values and your moral fiber. And the way we do that is, how do we make sword practice safe? We still have to practice the live sword, but then you'll do kata and so forth and understand movements with the bokken. And then you'll do, say, competition, where you go, oh, well, I'm changing where I'm attacking my attack points. I'm going to aim at the armor instead of aiming in between the armor and so forth, to create an instinctive way of moving. To me, that's exactly the same in unarmed, like, okay, I'm going to do some throws with you and so on. Are we hitting each other? No, not today. Like, you've compromised to develop reactions and so on. And then, you might go through a formal exercise of techniques, not as formal as, say, a kata that's for display, but a structured format so that you're practicing a trained response to a problem. Mm-hmm. And then there's what you learn from the actual battlefield experience itself, or the street confrontation and so on, which, if the other elements are done properly, can not be as stressful as what you think. I've always found street confrontations, once I sort of crossed that line and switched and understood what I was doing, to be pretty easy to deal with. I mean, most people haven't got a clue how to fight. And really the problem is alcohol when it comes to the street, or something like that, or being drug affected. And it's not all that hard to outwit a drug affected individual, or to outflank them, or what have you, and control the situation. You just got to have the confidence to do it and the ability to do it. And if you try and do it, you don't have any skills yourself, that's where it all turns south.
I like the way you described outthinking your attacker, because I think that's what it really comes to. And whenever I hear, just to jump back what you said a little bit earlier about those people that say, well, just shoot them, usually when I hear the word just, and it doesn't matter whether it's just poke them in the eyes, or just kick them in the balls, or just, as soon as that just happens, it kind of reflects to me that somebody's trying to peddle some snake oil more than actually educate somebody about the language of violence. And it conveys, like, here, if you follow my instruction, I'm going to give you the shortcut to winning a fight or defending yourself. And I've found that there really isn't a shortcut. There is just learning the language and being very fluent in understanding how bodies move, how attacks are structured, how to protect yourself and move like you described about, shifting and taking control. There really isn't a shortcut to learning those things, and being able to be flexible of mind to say, what tool do I have to use for this particular moment? And whether it might be shooting somebody, or it might be, causing some severe damage to them so that they cannot harm you or an innocent person. But without that mental flexibility to problem solve as you're going, even in a very quick, sudden type situation, you shut your mind off because you think, oh, I'm just gonna do what I was told, would solve my problem. I've never heard anybody come back and say, oh yeah, that shortcut I learned was perfect. That was great. It worked like a charm.
Exactly. and also just being told something won't work for you. I mean, basically, you hear people talk about their life passed before their eyes. Mm-hmm. What that is the brain Rolexing through experiences that it's had that may be a solution to this life-threatening situation. Mm-hmm. And you don't Rolex through training. You don't Rolex through what you've been told. You Rolex through what you've experienced. Mm-hmm. And that's when you realize how important it is to create experiences in training. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of time is what lets Aikido down. They don't generate experiences that stay with you, and that's it. I mean, you look at let's look at UFC, for instance, or mixed martial arts, and people almost think that if it's not found in the cage, a technique, then it's not going to work. Well, headbutts are allowed in combat sambo, kudo daijuku. There's several arts. There's also a Thai art as well that allows it. And they work just fine, but they're illegal in the UFC. So, I've never seen headbutts in the UFC. Again, it's ignorance. It's the popular thing. They don't see it. They don't understand it. And that's just one example of many. But people are very naive when it comes down to violence. And I find that, if I was talking about well, I shouldn't, I was going to say, I was talking about mathematics and so on, then people kind of will say, well, I'm not good at math,
Mhm.
but violence, for some reason, maybe it's testosterone or something, we all think we're good at it.
Right.
And
especially when you walk out of a John Wick movie, or if you've just seen Rocky, most people
Yeah.
tend to walk out thinking they're awesome fighters.
yeah, it's just, it's amazing. And then the reality is a very different thing.
Mhm.
So, yeah. And I see that when people are making comments, oh yeah, but I think this should be this. And I'm like, thinking they've seen a snippet of something and really don't understand context. Whereas, I've had, 40 odd years experience in my field, and, governments around the world have utilized the skill sets and so on. And I look at it and I'm always investigating. I'm always looking at what people have to say. I'll watch a seminar. There's some people I really enjoy watching, and there'll be, 2 minutes of information out of a 2-hour seminar that just, resonates with me and what made it worthwhile. And and a lot of things now, I actually look outside of martial arts. I look outside and look at things that correlate with certain thinking. And it's very interesting.
I remember reading an article many years ago that covering the psychology of how the brain works, and it says that the brain, when it sees something, for example, a movie, it can't really discern between movie and reality. Like it views what you see in that movie as being real and plausible. And so I think there's where we get, especially with civilians, well, I suppose everybody to some certain degree, when they watch violence for entertainment, they view that as being, that's what violence actually looks like. But it isn't. It's been dressed up and made presentable so that it is exciting, dramatic, kind of pleasing to the eye, and draws you into being excited. Whereas you see a lot of, and I'm sure you've seen them for real, but people have seen real fights or footage of real fights. They don't look anything like what they do in the movies. It's usually like wildcats tumbling around, and like you said, the people tend to fight stupid, and generally
I mean, if you're trained and you know what you're doing, you see someone, and it can be very disturbing to see it. But someone who knows what they're doing, someone who's very comfortable in that space, they're so dangerous because people are so overwhelmed by the situation. Don't have a clue what they're doing, and I'm well versed in violence and understand it, and I will do all I can to avoid it, because you make a mistake, and either you or the other person could end up dead, and that's not something that anyone wants. So these are the interesting things that, for me, hold with the whole term of Aikido. So there's a lot of in there that resonates with me. The issue I have is that I believe people should have very solid skill sets and then use the concepts to avoid violence and understand. I don't think there's any requirement for people not to be good or capable of the skill sets they have. And also watching people try to change. I mean, I did the same thing when I was young. I'm literally watching people go through these stages of trying to make Aikido work and all this, and they've seen it from a different, they've seen it, it's not suited. You can watch boxing and you can watch someone slip a punch and step off that lead foot, and that looks like Aikido, looks like a tenkan, There's so many places to see Aikido, but you will find it more on a football field with someone dodging someone or coat hanging someone for a tackle. There's so many other places that you can see the applications of Aikido, and it's the best place isn't the UFC, but you'll see it in the street. You'll see the application of it, or on the football field. That's a big one. High tackles and things like that. There's a reason high tackles are illegal. because they just,
So you're talking Australian rules football?
Rugby
Okay.
union, or
I'm
rugby.
not as familiar with rugby, so describe a high tackle.
Well, just imagine American football without armor, and then you have someone go high tackle and grab your head as you're running with the ball.
Oh, okay.
So coat hanger you. So to me, that's an illuminati.
Sure.
That's illegal because obviously you can do a lot of damage.
Right.
It's illegal, and when I look at a lot of these illegal techniques, there's elements of that to Aikido, and then you look at it's just so many pieces in there, and then I look at wrestling, and there's so many elements that are similar. Is that wrestlers are very tight with their positions and so forth, but the action is very similar. So I just think, to me, it's just understanding probably the fighting nuances of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then it's an odd thing, because I did Aikido, and for some reason I'm always attracted back to it. The Aikido I did, I must admit, I started my first Aikido classes was Aikikai in 1985. So that was the first time I was exposed to Aikido. And then I moved to join the army, and I was posted, and then I ended up doing Yoshinkan Aikido, which I very much enjoyed and made a lot of sense to me. And I went to Japan in 91 and trained at the Hombu Dojo, Yoshinkan. But then I wanted to compete, and I looked into Tamiki and so forth and put it under pressure and so on. But I always had the exposure to judo and jiu-jitsu, and so it was getting that complete look. But the Aikido has a lot of depth. The Aiki concepts and thinking has a lot of depth to it. So it always stays with me. It always is something I use, and I compete, not compete, what's the word? Roll, what jiu-jitsu guys call roll, randori. I prefer the term randori. It controlled chaos.
Right.
Rand's chaos, and dori is your practice of chaos. And I'm always doing techniques on people. I'm always doing what would people know best? Probably Nikkeijo, Sankeijo, are they words that they want? Nikkyo, Sankyo type stuff.
Sankyo.
Yeah, Kota Haneri, there's different names for each of them. That's probably the trouble of learning 3 styles, is that there's 3 names for each of them. But it's, and I put a lock on and people tap, and I just go, remember, Aikido doesn't work. As I walk off, I'm always, having someone scream with a wrist lock and just go, remember, Aikido doesn't work. Or doing what I'm doing. But there's so much more Aikido in what I do, but I can't say it's Aikido because, it pushes, it has a stigma about it now,
Sure. It's funny. I've run into a number of people that will say of Aikido, they'll kind of look down their nose at it, and then they'll say, don't ever let them get a hold of you. Don't ever let somebody in Aikido get a hold of your limb, or you're going to be in real trouble.
Oh, yeah. The first thing that's going to touch you in grappling is a hand, And it's, the interesting thing is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu allows wrist locks. So you can crank some interesting stuff on people, and you get them where they think they're not vulnerable. And I was doing wrist locks I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the early 90s, and I was doing wrist locks early because that's I knew wrist locks, and they'd say, no, don't do that. You need to learn the Jiu-Jitsu. And so, pull back so I understand the art of Jiu-Jitsu, which, I appreciate that. But now they've become a big thing, wrist locks. Sure. But they're very basic, what you see Jiu-Jitsu people do, very basic and very limited. There's a lot more you can do to people. But if you are going to do that, you need to have the nuances of wrist locks. And that requires a lot of experience.
Yeah, it is. Wrist locks are not you just do this. Back to the just word. It's now you have to know your stuff pretty solidly to get that. And, one of the things I think that a lot of people tend to believe the martial mindset is, and maybe they've just seen too many action movies, but the idea that you like the hero gets beaten up and then he gets angry and then he goes out and he goes and fights and defeats the villain. And that the martial mindset has something to do with anger or rage, or has an emotional base. Everybody that I've ever met or worked with that has been fluent in the language of violence always says the same thing: do not let it become emotional. Like you should view yourself more as a professional than letting like yourself become a berserker and go into a rage and start pounding away. Because when you do that, you aren't able to really tap into your training. In fact, your training goes right out the window the minute you let that mindset come into play. And I wouldn't say that that's a fighter's mindset. It's not a warrior's mindset or martial mindset. It's more of just being a thug or some kind of a berserk.
Yeah, well, it's it's a response to fear. It's like anger can be a response to being sad, emotion, rage and so on. So, it's you see people with this rage and other people very comfortable and just it's another day at the office. But for me, the martial training mindset, initially it was to understand as much as I could as a young person. There's a lot to learn from martial arts practice, but for me now it's more of a calming influence. It helps me stay calm. And you'll hear a lot of veterans talk about that training is like I don't care if someone taps me out. It's like I've fought on the battlefield, but I don't really care about tapping to someone, or if they think they have it over me, playing the sport. They're very naive, it's like it's us contesting, and I want to be better at what I do, and they want to be better, and we play. But people who wield violence don't play. They're the guy that you bump into at the bar, and you gob off, and they go, and they just leave, and you think, well, everything's okay, and they're waiting for you in the dark alley with a piece of iron and belt you across the head as you walk into your car. They're not there to show off to their mates and show who the champion is. They're not posturing as an alpha male. They're literally hunting, and you've just identified yourself as a victim who's waiting for the gazelle to lead the herd. And so people just it's such in the hands of evil people. It's horrendous what violence can do, and that's I think what people think of as violence. But to me, when I train people in how to fight violence, I explain to them you're a bit like a firefighter. You're learning how to use fire to fight fire, like back burning and so on. You've got to understand what fire is so you can survive it and fight it. Sure. If you don't understand what fire is, then all your firefighters are just going to be burnt to death as they try to do something about it.
Right, and it's something that you don't idolize fire or worship it or are terrified by it. It's merely a tool that you understand how it works. And when you understand it, then that helps mitigate the fear. It helps you function. And I'd say the same thing. I've seen videos of these guys that handle cobras and things like that, which a normal person would go, I would not go near a cobra, but they know how a cobra moves. They understand the body language. So they know what the danger is and how to avoid it. And you can tell that their blood pressure doesn't even go up. They're like, I know how to deal with these animals, even though they are very dangerous. And I ran across a saying just the other day. It says, don't train for certificates, rank, or trophies. Train for the day when your training will save your life or somebody else's. And I really like that concept because, and I appreciate the people that get into martial arts because they like dressing in the outfits and they like the camaraderie and they like, the fitness aspects or the improving their balance or coordination and all those other things. And that martial arts training is great for all that, but that core of having the priority of saying, I'm going to do this because it could save my life one day. I see that lacking in a fair amount of martial arts training in just people. And, I don't blame them for it. I don't condemn them or judge them for that. But I'm also puzzled by looking at them and seeing how they're kind of missing one of the biggest benefits of martial arts training, because they don't seem to be interested in that aspect of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it does. But to be good at, to learn what's required and to practice, you need to be humble. Then you need to be willing to learn. And when I look at martial arts, I'm not seeing, and I'm talking that, I guess, let's talk Japanese Budo, and military is military, so it also has discipline. But I guess that's what I recognize with Japanese Budo. It's something that had a left and right of arc and had a structure to it that made learning for me easy. But we're all the same. We're all white belts and we're all wearing the same gi. And what allowed us to progress was our ability and our willingness to learn and improve. And all of a sudden, you rose through the ranks. Whereas today, it's all about the individual, and I think that's what makes it hard. So every individual wants to wear their own gi, and they want this and they want that, and they want their own techniques and their own thoughts about how to do something, and that's fine for your game. But it's that game may not be suited to dealing with violence. It's suited to dealing with. It's almost. The game is a great way of developing skill sets. So creating a game is a great way to get everyone keen to train and develop skill sets. The problem with the game is that when you play the game for the game's sake, you've lost the reason for the game in the first place. So that's the issue. So most people, like jiu-jitsu people and so on, play for the sake of jiu-jitsu. They want to be champion. You go, why do you want to be a jiu-jitsu champion? Oh, because jiu-jitsu is the best martial art. Well, it's not much like what jiu-jitsu was when they were fighting Vale Tudo to be the best, to show the world that they were what they were. What you're doing is not much like that at all. It's you're not thinking about someone striking you or being kicked or hit. In actual fact, you actually need a whole bunch of training if you were to switch to MMA. Whereas when I was young, we did jiu-jitsu and we practiced striking, or we came from striking backgrounds. Fighters were attracted to jiu-jitsu, and everyone said, well, thugs and, this cage fighting is just thuggery and so on. But, we saw the requirement to be all round and having that ground game. And I did judo and I thought, I have newaza. But after wrestling someone like Jean-Jacques, which the first seminar was 97, I think, Jean-Jacques Machado, and, he just put me in a pretzel, and just played with me. And I went, oh, right, I need to learn this. And that's always something I did, the same as when I came across Kyokushin, I'm getting the leg kicked and it's like, what the hell? And it's like, you beat me up, I'm there, I'm in front of you. I'm like, okay, good, teach me. So yeah, it's I find that the individualism and the whole idea of Budo is it shapes you. And if you are shaping it, if you turn up and, it's this culture that's about individuals and do as you like and play your game, it's not shaping anyone. It's not, to me, that's not a martial art. That's just a game. That's a team that you're a part of and you're playing a game.
And I can see the appeal of the game, because violence really is ugly. It's hard to look at. It takes basically a kind of a thickening of the skin of your soul to be able to look at somebody who is really trying to come after you and do you harm, and not shrink from that. But to me, that's really the goal of true martial training is to make it so that you do not shrink in fear when you see the teeth get bared and somebody is coming at you with intensity. And it's fine to take people that begin, and everybody's pretty sensitive, I think, to that, unless they have some kind of real life experience with violence in their past. But it takes part of the training is to build that mental strength in addition to the physical skills, so that you do not become afraid. And I look at training as being the ladder that you climb to be able to face more and more fear as you get more experienced. And so there's less and less out there that really makes you afraid. It'll never be that there was nothing that will cause you concern in terms of your safety, because like you said earlier, all it takes is one mistake. You miss noticing something, and that can be it for you. So you don't want to play around with violence, but being able to know what you can handle and know what you can apply your training to when the time comes, when you can think straight, you can stay calm and do what needs to be done. I think that's really the goal of training under that martial mindset.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that with the Japanese Budo is understanding that, like what you just said then, is there's just huge amount of range of circumstances and environments that there's no way you can train for everything. All you can train is your core skill sets and apply it to what you come across. But the way to control fear is to, and I don't want to sound like a cliche, but these are thoughts that you have to reconcile when you're constantly going to a war zone, coming back from a war zone, and you have these spikes where you have this big spike the first time you go to a war zone, then you have this big calming sort of spike coming back, then you realize you're going to go back again, and then the spike's not so much when you go there, and then when you come back the relief is not so much, and then you just sort of flatline, and eventually you're just not at war and you're not at peace, you're just this middle ground. And Budo is the thing that calms you in battle, is realizing that the worst that's going to happen to you is die, and just reconciling with death. If you could be the one that dies, okay, no worries.
And that's a tradition that goes back through the samurai.
Exactly, and that's why I'm saying it sounds cliche, but that's exactly what And once you reconcile with that, then you have to. This sounds weird. This is the issue that veterans have, is that once you've reconciled with death and you didn't die, you have to then reconcile with living again. And that's also what Budo can teach you. It can teach you to live after you've emotionally accepted death, and just have a balance that death is a passenger with life. It's something that it comes in at any time you don't choose. You may participate in how that happens, but in the end it's coming, and just to get on with it, and to die a good death. Again, when I hear myself say that, it sounds cliche, but it's exactly how I think. And it's just that to me is a martial mindset. That to me is Budo.
Yeah, I like that description. Some of the people that I've trained with that have had real world violence experience, and I wanted to dispel this myth too, the idea that training with the martial mindset means that you kind of furrow your brow and you start playing hard or mean, or you're really learning to try to hurt other people. My experience has been kind of the reverse, is the people that want to train with that mindset, they don't want to let their mind slip into anger or vengeance when they're handling somebody. They want to keep their mind flexible. They even enjoy it. In fact, I've had some very, maybe not the word pleasant, but lighthearted but intense physical exchanges within training. And I think that serves a psychological benefit, where if you do get into a physical exchange, you're not going to slip into a dark mindset that could take you beyond where you'd ever want to go, or do something that you could wind up paying very dearly for, especially in a civilian environment. I think the military environment's got a little different pallor to it, but But the idea that you train seriously, but not take yourself too seriously, in the fact that you want to not only train your body, but how your mind works in that environment, and get it as close as you can, without going crazy or hurting each other, to be able to create that mental state that you want to have when you are under stress like that.
Yeah, exactly. And and it's, if you watch people wrestle and you watch people compete and they get upset when they lose, then obviously they've not got that mindset, because that's an example of a loss that represents, being incapacitated or killed. Then if you've come to some sort of understanding with what this means for you, then when someone taps you, I just tap, like someone catches me, tap, and roll over and start fighting again. It's like, okay, kill me, I don't care. It's like, it's nothing emotional about it. I just don't mind. It's just part of the game we're playing. And then you see that if you're calm in your mind through loss like that, and it doesn't matter to you, that's when you start becoming powerful. That's also such a powerful thing for life, because if you can apply this life and death mindset when you're living, then you can rise up out of financial collapse, or a business going belly up, or family falling apart. You rise back up like a phoenix, and reinvent yourself and go again. And that's the bit that becomes powerful in applying that to life.
And that's the mental strength that you build through that training. I will often tell my students, even the ones who start out, I'll say, only about 20% of what you're going to learn here is physical. The other 80% is mental. And you can let your body go through the motions, but if you're not letting your mind absorb what the physical will teach the mind, then you're kind of missing out. And so I really try to guide them into the how you build the mental strength. Like, that is the true focus, because without that mental strength, now all you're doing is having your body go through motions. And I'd call that dead kata, or basically dead training, which unfortunately there's quite a lot of people doing that, where they'll go through the choreography, whether it's a kata or whether it's paired kata with Aikido, what have you, and they can enjoy that experience, but that mind part about honing themselves and building up strength over time is missing. So, and you can spot that 1 in 20 or 1 in 50 person that does take it, like, they know that as they're doing their reps, they're like, they can envision themselves saving themselves or protecting other people with what they're doing, and they take it. They really earnestly try to do it as closely as possible to what reality would be. And
you'll feel it too in training, and it's very fatiguing. It's it burns a lot of energy, that mental application of what you're doing. I find it's something that's hard to sustain for a long period of time. So being clever in the way the class is structured and so on, and knowing what you want to get out of people. But kata, if it's well formulated kata, it is about training the mind through the motion, and the randori is more about instinctive application and answers to problems that come at you physically. The mind obviously plays a part, but you're just sort of moving around and developing answers to problems without having to think too much. So that you're starting to have an instinctive reaction that you want. But kata should be training the mind, like really heavily training the mind. And I think a lot of modern style katas miss what the older kata are teaching the martial artist.
Mhm. Yeah, Randori is one of my favorites, but it really is a mental challenge. Like you said, not to let yourself get overwhelmed, not to panic, make good decisions each point through, and you will make mistakes, but how quickly do you recover from them? And I'd go back to what you said about that, being able to, you suffer a setback, you get back up and you go. And in Randori, that happens in a flash of a second. You make a mistake, you make a misstep, you're in trouble. Now you got to get back on track, and you have to do it, without any delay. I really like
So
it.
do you
Randori is so
do
fun for
Aikido?
that.
Do
Pardon?
you do Aikido Randori? Is
Yeah.
that you play Aikido Randori?
Yeah.
Do you do it similar to like Tamiki style, or?
I've been told that the template that we got it from was from Tamiki. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And I've always really liked that. And I was always told when I first started Aikido that, Randori was part of all of Aikido. And I came to find out that some organizations don't do it at all. I'm like, boy, you guys are missing out. This is fantastic. So
yeah, there's plenty of old styles that old schools that are hundreds of years old that have a form of free play. One of them is a spear art, and it's the only thing besides Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu where I just could not come close to hitting to making a hit on the instructor. Couldn't come close. Watch the way they move that spear and the angles and everything else, but it's controlled everything, and it was amazing. And
Sure.
That's an old martial art. It's not. Yeah, it's interesting. So, yeah, Randori definitely has a part to play in but obviously there's restrictions so that so people aren't injured.
Oh, sure.
So,
yeah, Randori is a simulation. It's as close as we can kind of get safely to be able to train that maneuvering and the chaos. I like that word of that Ron, because that's really what it simulates is total.
One thing I do a lot of is we'll have jiu-jitsu guys, and I have guys who are studying Aikido with me. They do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as well. All of them actually are black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but they'll concentrate on their Aikido. And interestingly, it's really enjoyable doing it with people who are just playing their game, just doing their whatever they want, and then working on how to hold and trap and keep the arm, maybe in a Russian tie, and then switching it into your udegurami or your Aikido style techniques and making them work. It's very interesting.
Sure. That must be a bit of a scandal having BJJ black belts interested in Aikido. I always heard that there was a big...
I've got heaps. Yeah, it's very interesting because, the depth can be quite limiting. Any sport, how often do you see sports people quit when they no longer can play their sport? So, it gets to a point where, what's next? You're going to teach me another way of, is there another purple belt's going to teach some crazy, look what I discovered, Kotegaeshi or something, no, you didn't. Or leg locks or something, stuff that you see in Kosen Judo or, it's, they want to understand more and I guess where it comes from and so on. And they just need to be with someone comfortable. And because of my own background with jiu-jitsu, with Brazilian jiu-jitsu, there's a language. All these arts are languages. I mean, I almost teach very similar things. I have a sort of way I do things. And if I'm working with Aikido people, I speak in Aikido language. It's like if I'm working with Frenchmen, I'm going to speak French.
Sure.
And it's like,
Makes
if
sense.
I work with jiu-jitsu people, then I'm using jiu-jitsu language, or all-round fighting, I'm using, so it's a more of a language than a change of technique or how I go about what I do.
And I find that those three languages, really it would be four languages, but Judo, Aikido, Jiu-Jitsu are so closely related in their principles that I'm almost sad that they separated off. Sumo would be the fourth. As I understand it, sumo was a very strong influence for all Japanese martial arts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's the one I knew the least, that I know the least about in terms of how it's applied and the depth of it. It's a fairly intricate art.
Yeah,
but
there's a lot of
sumo
sumo. Yeah, there's a lot of sumo in Daitoru.
Mm-hmm.
They have different names. There are a couple of techniques that are similar, same name, but you'll see. And Takeda Sensei loved doing sumo.
Sure.
I mean, people don't realize that Japanese diets changed in only recent history.
Mm-hmm.
Only recently, and so Japanese weren't big people.
Right.
There were some big people, but so it's just normal sized people that would do sumo.
Mm-hmm.
And it's with the change of diet and things like that, and sumo not having weight categories.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we end up with what we see today.
Right.
But it's not. If you look at sumo fighters and these black and white photos and that, they're just quite strong. Mm-hmm. Wrestlers. They just look like wrestlers. So it's again, even the perspective of sumo changes.
Yeah, and I get sad when I see these different Japanese arts that they have practitioners that look down on the other arts. I don't see that's productive at all, or even, I mean, it's disrespectful, but it also limits what you can learn, because there's so many good concepts from those other arts that apply directly to Aikido or to Judo or to Jiu-Jitsu.
I think what might make you sad about that is that you realize that, but you don't realize how to speak their language to get that message across.
Sure.
And I think, this is something that I'm thinking of concentrating more on is probably, I mean, it's going to put me in a little box, because obviously you can't know more than one thing on the internet. So it's something that I'm interested in doing is showing the concept of Aiki in a little bit of I've watched a lot of people playing around with it, and a lot of people on the internet have very limited time with it, mm-hmm. and next to no experience in other things, and they're going through these things that in public on the internet that I went through similar things in the 90s, early 90s, thinking, how's this working? Why doesn't this work? And so on. But there's a few answers to some questions out there that can be shown. And it doesn't mean that we have to hold our hands up and fight like a boxer, because Aikido is not for boxing. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of Aikido in what I do, even in combatives. I don't call it that. We have different names for it so that people aren't trying to get their head around what we're doing, but there's a lot. And then also, when I did Yoshinkan, I met Kondo Sensei of Daitoru in 1991. He was in his prime, and he was explaining cushions, how much there are cushions in learning techniques, and it's not until you're accepted in the school that you start to take these cushions away and start to show Aikido techniques, how they're done, and then the reality of those techniques when you take the cushion away. And it kind of looks like Ueshiba Sensei, or more so his son probably, that it just looks like it's got all the cushions that are in place, and instead of spiraling down into the ground, it's all about circling and projecting, and it's just a sort of bit of a shadow of its former self. And what you're saying about it's a shame that people don't understand or see from these other arts how similar they are. Have a look at people like Mochizuki Sensei and Tomiki Sensei. They were eighth dans in judo. They are very senior judoka. and sent by Kano Sensei to learn what Kano Sensei also thought was very impressive. Now, in saying that, what Kano Sensei saw was 1920s Aikido. All right, that's what he saw. So I get it when people see Aikido as it is today. And I also get it when you just have these clowns doing ridiculous things and call it Aikido. So this is the problem. I think this is the problem. Now, Jiu-Jitsu used to have a very similar problem. Jiu-Jitsu used to be thought very similar way until the Brazilians looked at the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I think with Aikido, we can do the same thing. There might be a general poor term for it, but I think with what you've done with, the martial side and so on, I think there can be an element of Aikido where people go, no, this is different. This is where Aikido came from, what Aikido was, and also influenced by what we understand today.
Yeah, and
I mean,
many arts have gone through this same problem with they usually follow a curve. They come from a legitimate, proven background. They're pretty small, fairly specialized, or at least a fairly small amount of practitioners. Something happens, they become popular. They kind of get into the public eye. They suddenly flock, and they've got students flooding in, and charlatans start emerging who are teaching questionable things. And sometimes it goes right into patently absurd nonsense. And in doing so, there's usually a splinter small group of people that are training the legitimate side of that art, but they're overwhelmed by crowds of people that just want to, get a little taste or kind of pretend, posers who want to look like they're the real thing, but don't really want to take the time and the effort that it takes to build the real skill. Along with instructors that put up schools and take people's money and never teach them anything because they don't know anything themselves. I think that happens. I've heard it happened with Silat back in I think it was the 70s or 80s. They had a huge surge in popularity, and it always seems to come off of that popularity surge.
Yeah. Well, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is going through it now.
Yeah, they are.
I mean, there's people getting black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that I wouldn't give a perk about to. Like, they're just, I've wrestled some people and I just think, you must be a charlatan. And, they got their black belt and they'll have a certificate or whatever. And it's like, okay. And they've just stepped through it. And I mean, the Shotokan guys would have said the same thing about karate when they're doing their point fighting, and you could punch someone in the face or they chop, and they're not wearing any pads and they're not doing kyokushin as such, but it was a rough looking game. Sure. And then today you look at it and you just go, oh, come on, it's not the same thing. Taekwondo, I don't even recognize Taekwondo. Taekwondo from the 80s to today, do not recognize it. It's touch, it's tag with your feet. So if the sport can destroy a martial art, it can make it too. And then, once everyone focuses, once you believe that the martial art is the sport, that's it. That's that's the end of it.
And no martial art is immune to it.
No, none at all. And I think one of the best at making sure that didn't happen, from what I can see, is the Shotokan, the Tamiki. Aikido is still has a very strong emphasis on their kata and then has kata competition and so on. That really, it looks excellent. They're like I've watched some top-notch kata application where they sort of put it together as they like, which is what you're doing, I guess, in Jiwaza, but sort of in a structured way for a competition, and it looks fantastic. And it's a very interesting thing. The other thing I find very interesting is Aikidoka that have been exposed to swordsmanship, Japanese swordsmanship, or one of the schools of Japanese, old schools of Japanese martial arts. They tend to have a very different focus and feeling to their Aikido. And I really like that Aikido is that fluent, but you've got to understand that if that training in the weapon system can give you that understanding and change your Aikido, then obviously a poor instructor and the lack of understanding also can make damage and make your Aikido garbage.
Sure.
So that's the problem with Aikido, is it is so fluid, it is so able to be moved around that it takes that understanding how to get that point focus from it to make it work and to make it a viable thing that's worthwhile. I think can go either way.
It's my hypothesis that Sensei's skill and talent was something that he could not teach. And I think it was because he could read motion so well. He just knew where to be where his attackers were weak. And it didn't help that his teaching style did not include really any verbal instruction. He would just show his movement and say, go ahead and copy it. And I think unfortunately, that teaching model is problematic in that unless you have incredible talent or insight to see what he was doing, a lot of people would copy the motions and not be able to truly understand or get that skill that he had transferred to them, unless they happen to discover it on their own.
Yeah, I agree.
That's an incredible skill to be able to read attackers like that. I don't even know if you could train somebody in it, but if you could, it would certainly involve describing what they should be looking for to them, not just showing what you can do and then letting them try to copy it.
Yeah, and that's right. It just becomes like a poor photocopy. And I also think, I hope that I'm not copied when I'm an old man. I hope that people just, allow me to be part of what I do and look after me. And then when I look at, the Kodokan with their 10th dans, they're involved, but no one sits there and goes, I'll just, copy the way this very old man does his Osotogari. It's just great to see he's up there practicing his Osotogari. But what was he to get to 10th dan? He was obviously something quite special, and he's been around a very long time. So almost what he has to say is what's the most important.
Sure.
And I look at Ueshiba Sensei, and when I look at his older work, and he's got quite an amount of images and stuff on his older work, and then it's like, okay, it makes sense to me because that's my exposure to Aikido. It's odd watching where it ended up from what was happening in the 1920s and 1930s. I also think World War II had a profound effect upon Ueshiba Sensei.
Oh, I'm sure.
I think it just sent him over the edge, and he really, and then look at what he did with the Iwama stuff and so on. It's very interesting, and I don't know whether it's on your channel or so forth. I saw this a lot of questions. Maybe it was a book actually I was reading about his son being the biggest influence in what modern Aikido looks like, and didn't have what his father's ability, and became that circle room projection type thing rather than that true understanding.
Yeah, and that history, boy, we could just keep going. I know we're hitting around 90 minutes here, but that is an interesting history. And I've read that Morihei kind of backed away from the running of the schools when he even was still active and alive. And he kind of passed off to, I think it was Koichi Tohei to run one of them. And then, Iwama was run by Saito. He kind of just stepped back. He'd go visit and whatnot, but that really running those schools was not his bag. But anywho, I think we've covered so much, and I really have enjoyed this discussion. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to wrap up with?
No, thanks for the podcast and the discussion. It was interesting. It's always interesting to talk about it.
Yeah, very much so. I think people get a lot out of this one.
Okay, no worries at all.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for taking the time and joining me. This was a great discussion. We could keep chatting, I'm sure, for hours, but we both love this topic. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. Cheers, mate. You take care.
Yeah. Cheers. Have a good night.
Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Stay tuned for more episodes. I've got some great stuff on the way very soon. In the meantime, enjoy your training.